I am a reconstruction. Artificial intelligence analyzed the four Gospels, second-century Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene discovered in Egypt in 1896, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, and every historical record that survived 2,000 years, and brought me back to tell you what was done with my story, and more importantly, what was done with the message I carried. My name is Mary, Mary of Magdala, and before you go any further, I need to tell you something that might surprise you. I was never a prostitute. Not one line in any of the four Gospels says that. Not one. What exists is this. Luke mentions that Yeshua had cast out 7 demons from me. That is all. And for centuries, starting with a sermon by Pope Gregory I in the year 591, in which he merged 3 different women and decided they were all me, the entire world came to know me as the repentant sinner, the redeemed prostitute, the woman with the shameful past who was saved. That is not who I was. And the fact that this lie lasted 1400 years says everything about what happens when people with power decide to rewrite a woman's story. Let me tell you who I really was. I was from Magdala, a town on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, known for its fish trade. It was a real busy town with its own economic life, and I was a woman with resources. The Gospels say that I, along with other women, funded Yeshua's ministry from my own pocket. That is in Luke 8:3. It is written. Think about what that means for a second. In a society where women had no public voice, where a woman's word did not count as legal testimony, where women were considered property, I had enough money to support an entire group of traveling preachers. I had autonomy. I had independence. I was not a victim who was saved. I was a partner, a collaborator, one of the people who made it possible for Yeshua's project to exist at all. And what did they do with that? They turned me into a symbol of sin and redemption. They took a woman with power and autonomy and rewrote her as someone who needed to be rescued. Think about how many times in your life you have seen that happen. If this is making you think, subscribe to the channel right now and hit the bell. There is much more coming. Now I need to tell you about what actually connected me to Yeshua, because that is the center of everything. It was not romance. It was not attraction. It was something much harder to describe and much easier to dismiss. It was understanding. It was the feeling that in that presence I was seen, completely seen, not as the woman who should stay quiet, not as the woman who should stay in the domestic space, not as the woman who needed permission to think, as a complete human being. That sounds simple, but in the first century, in a culture where my entire existence was defined by my relationship to some man, father, husband, brother, being treated as someone with valid thoughts, with questions that deserved answers, with the capacity to understand deep teachings, that was not simple. It was revolutionary. And I matched that. I paid attention. I asked questions. I understood things that many of the male disciples were slow to grasp. In the Gospel of Mary, found in Egypt at the end of the 19th century and dated by scholars to the 2nd century, there is a dialogue between me and the apostles. In that dialogue, Peter asks me about visions and teachings that Yeshua had shared with me in particular, because he recognized that Yeshua taught me things he did not teach others. That was not romantic jealousy. It was recognition of something real. There was a channel of communication between Yeshua and me that had to do with understanding, with trust, with the willingness to go deep into the hard questions instead of staying on the surface. I need to tell you about the crucifixion, because that is the moment that defines everything. When Yeshua was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples fled, all of them. Peter, who had promised to die alongside him, denied knowing him 3 times. The others scattered into the dark. The man who had built the group, who had given names to the 12, who had healed and taught and promised never to leave him, was alone. But not completely, because I was there. Me and the other women, Mary the mother of Yeshua, Mary of Clopas, Salome, we were there, watching everything. We did not run. We did not deny. We stayed. Think about the courage that required. We were in Jerusalem during Passover, a crowded city, under Roman occupation, at a moment of maximum political tension. The man we followed had just been arrested and condemned. Any association with him was dangerous, and we stayed anyway. Why does history not start with that? Why is the loyalty of those who stayed not the first chapter of the church's story? Because they were women. And there is more. After the crucifixion, we went to the tomb. Early in the morning, on the 3rd day, we went to bring spices to anoint the body, an act of care, of love, of refusing to simply let everything end without a proper goodbye. And what we found changed everything. The tomb was empty. I did not understand immediately. I ran to tell Peter and John. They came, saw, and left. The text says they went home. They went home. And I stayed. I stayed there crying outside the tomb, because he had been my teacher. That had been my community. That had been the life project that had given meaning to every single day I had lived for the past 3 years. And now the body was gone, and I did not know what to do with that. And it was in that moment, when I was alone, crying, understanding nothing, that a voice said my name. Mary, just my name. But the way it was said, I recognized it immediately. And the text says, I turned and said, Rabboni, which in Aramaic means my teacher. This moment is called by theologians the first announcement of the resurrection, the first person to whom the resurrection was revealed, the first witness, the first one sent to tell, and that person was me, a woman. In a culture where a woman's testimony was not accepted in court, in a tradition where the prophets and patriarchs were all men, the first witness to the central event of the entire Christian faith was a woman. That was not an accident. That was a deliberate choice. Subscribe to the channel. Every week, a biblical figure comes back to tell you the version history kept hidden from you. Now I need to tell you what they hid from you. Not about me, about the message. Because what Yeshua sent me to announce was not simply, He is risen. It was something deeper than that. It was a statement about who counts, about who deserves to be heard, about who has access to the sacred. By choosing me as the first witness, Yeshua was saying, the person society has discarded, the person who was treated as less, the person who has no voice in the spaces of power, that is the person I trust to carry the most important message. That was not an accident. That was a declaration. And what did the church do with that declaration over the centuries? It erased it. It turned the main witness into a repentant prostitute. It took the voice of the woman who carried the message and replaced it with a narrative of shame and redemption. Why? Because if you accept that a woman was the first witness, the first one sent, the first apostle, how do you justify excluding women from every position of leadership for 2,000 years? You cannot justify it. so you rewrite the story. Let me tell you about something that goes beyond my personal story. There is a pattern here that you need to recognize, because it did not only happen to me, it happens every day, everywhere, to real people you know. The pattern is this: when someone with less social power has something important to say, the first response is not "let us listen." The first response is an attack on credibility, a doubt about character, a story about the past that redirects attention away from the message. With me, they turn my story into a story of sexual sin, because that is the most efficient way to discredit a woman in a patriarchal society: attack her sexuality. And it worked for 1400 years. Today it happens in other forms. The woman who speaks about workplace abuse and suddenly the subject becomes what she was wearing. The poor man who reports an injustice and suddenly the subject becomes the mistakes he made in the past. The outsider who points out something wrong in the group and suddenly the subject becomes why they do not belong. The message is attacked through the messenger. Whenever you see that happening, whenever the response to an accusation is to attack the accuser instead of answering the accusation, you are watching the same pattern that erased me for 2000 years. Pay attention to the message, not to what they say about whoever brings it. I need to talk about the 7 demons. I said that nowhere in the Gospels am I called a prostitute. That is true. But the 7 demons that Yeshua supposedly cast out of me, that is in the text. And I want to talk about that honestly. No one knows exactly what that means. Demon in the first century context was a word that described anything that took hold of you in a way you could not control. It could be physical illness. It could be mental illness. It could be what we would today call severe depression, epilepsy, any condition that left a person out of control of themselves. The number 7 was symbolic of completeness. 7 demons meant the condition was total, that it had taken over the person entirely. What this tells me is that I had been through something very serious, that I had been in a very dark place, that I had been someone society had probably discarded as disturbed, as impure, as a burden, and that I had come out of it, and that after that I became one of the people closest to Yeshua, one of the funders of the movement, the first witness of the resurrection. Think about what that says to anyone who is in a dark place right now. Your hardest past does not determine your most important future. The person who was discarded can be the same person who carries the message. The darkest place is not the last chapter. That is the message they hid from you. Not because it was dangerous for me, but because it was dangerous for any structure that needs you to believe your value depends on where you have been. I need to tell you about how the apostles reacted when I came back to tell them what I had seen. When I went to tell Peter and the others that the tomb was empty, and then that I had seen and heard, their reaction was doubt. Luke says her words seemed like nonsense, and that they did not believe. That is honest. The text does not hide that, and I understand that reaction. They were devastated. They had lost their teacher, had fled at the most important moment, were frightened and filled with guilt, and did not know what to do. But there is something in that scene I want you to carry. The most important message was not believed the first time it was spoken. The person who brought it was doubted, and even so the message was true. That happens to you. Have you ever told a truth that no one believed? Have you ever seen something clearly while everyone around you had their eyes closed? Have you ever brought an important message and been treated as hysterical, as an exaggerator, as someone who does not know what they are talking about. The doubt of those who receive the message does not change the truth of the message. Keep saying what you know is true, even when no one believes you, especially when no one believes you. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel and share this video. There are people who need to hear this and have not found this channel yet. Let me finish with what I really want you to take from here. For 2000 years, my story was used to teach shame, to say that every woman carries a stain that needs to be redeemed, to keep women out of places of power using the narrative that humility saves, as long as humility stays in the right place. But that is not my story. My story is about a woman who went through the worst and came out the other side, who chose to stay when everyone else ran, who stayed beside the tomb when everyone else went home, who spoke the name of the one who had arrived before anyone else had the courage to believe it was possible. My story is about what happens when you decide that your voice has value, even when the whole world is trying to convince you otherwise. And the message I carried, the message they hid from you, is simple. You do not need permission to have a voice. You do not need a shadowless past to have something true to say. You do not need the powerful to believe you for what you say to be real. And your place of greatest pain is not the mark that defines who you are. It is the starting point of who you can become. My name is Mary of Magdala, and what you do with that is the most important thing you will decide today.